Hello, so this will be the last video for Film GCSE, and this is for paper 2, and this is a Skyfall focus. So Skyfall has one specialist area that you're going to be focusing on. Obviously, they could ask you about any of the other things I've talked about before, so let me just quickly go back to show you those elements that they could ask you on any film. Let me just get back to it. They could ask you literally any of these things: mise-en-scene, cinematography, sound and editing, context. But for Skyfall, your main area is going to be aesthetics, which is the look and feel of the film. Now, they could ask you a question in the exam that says look or feel, or look or mood, or something along those lines to make to sort of, how does it style created? How is it style created? Now, there are 4 things that you could talk about here, and there are more than these 4 things, but these are just 4 things that could be useful. So there's a use of color, so blues versus oranges to display the ground field work versus new age spying. What I mean by ground field work is Bond's role as a spy. He is rolling around in the mud. He's getting down the nitty gritty, dirty elements of spying. Okay, and then you've got M and the other team, and also Silver, which is all about new age spying, which is doing things from a distance. And characters like Q represent that, okay? So ground field work and new age spying are both opposing each other because they both have different sort of goal. They have the same goal in mind, but they go about it in different methods, okay? So the use of color is really important to display that, okay? The use of opposites is important as well, or juxtaposition. So Silver versus Bond, for example. Silver and Bond both have similar backgrounds, but they are opposing forces because Silver does all of his jobs through tech and exploiting those modern day practices, whereas Bond is still sort of stuck in the past. He eventually wins, but he has to modernize in some way or go back to basics in order to win. There's also framing at the center of shots. Both Bond and M and also Silver are framed at the center of shots to show they're in control or to show that they have immense power in a sequence. So Bond himself becomes a little bit unstable after he's shot. So he's not shot necessarily strictly in the center. He's slightly off center. But then obviously when he gets back into his prime, he's shot in the center frame. The same as M, who's in control, and Silver, who's in control. The other aesthetic element is Nolan-esque cinema. Now, it's called Nolan-esque because it's named after Christopher Nolan and his sort of pioneering work in creating darker stories for already established characters. So, for example, his use of this darker, grittier style on the Dark Knight trilogy heavily influenced the aesthetic style of Skyfall. They're taking an already established hero character like Bond and they're making him darker and grittier in this world. And I'll go into that a little bit more detail later. So mise-en-scene, what could they ask you? Props such as Bond's gun, the car, and so on are all iconographic, okay, which means they're big icons of Bond and linked to the nostalgia of the series. All of these things have come back full circle from the original Bond films, and people watching them will feel a level of nostalgia, okay? Costumes such as Bond's suit and Silver's suit being parallel or also defining features of those characters. So Bond's suit is very defining of him, the same way as Silver's suit parallels Bond's suit, because whereas Bond has like a lighter color on the inside and darker on the outside, Silver has a darker color on the inside and a lighter color on the outside to show that they are simultaneously linked but also opposing forces. There's also setting as well, with Shanghai shows the futurism of New Age spying with these beautiful kind of neon signs and these blue glows. You've got elements of Britain as well for the Britishness that's apparent in the films, the MI6 building, shots of London, especially towards the end, the use of the British flag, really important. And Silver's layer demonstrates a fusion between old spying and New Age tech to show that there is sort of a nuance that you're capable of doing. Cinematography. Now, camera positioning is really important in Bond because the audience is often thrust into the action with camera POV on crashing cars and so on. It adds to the intensity of the film and also the genre. The action genre is meant to be quite upbeat and intense because you're meant to be involved in that action. Close-ups, there's a heavy use of close-ups to connect us to Bond and align us with him as he's getting old and tired in compared to his opponents and colleagues. And we're seeing how Bond has been around for such a long time that is he still fit for this world? Chiaroscuro lighting, so that's a lot of low-key contrast lighting, like heavy emphasis on shadows to emphasize Bond's role as an agent. And you've also got vibrant luminescent lighting in the Shanghai sequence and to a lesser extent MI6, because there's a heavy use of blue and vibrant bright lights to link to technology, okay? Then you've got editing and sound questions. So the Skyfall theme, all the Bond themes are pretty much performed by British artists. There's been a few that haven't been, but most of them have been British artists. And the song became iconic when it was released and adds a sense of nostalgia to this day for the film. If you mention Skyfall, people probably know the soundtrack because it's so iconic. You've also got the Bond chime, which goes dun. They use part of that chime, the bit, at the in some sequences from the film. Okay, so right in the opening, when we see Bond, we see the and then he's right at the end of the corridor, and then it cuts out, and he walks towards the camera. It shows that this is a new chapter for Bond. So it has that link to the old Bond with the Bond theme tune, but it doesn't fully use the theme tune until later on. There's an element of using the theme tune nearing the start of the train sequence where he jumps onto the train. They use part of the full sequence, but it's quite ironic because Bond, rather than landing quite gracefully on this train, ends up rolling and almost falling off it to show that Bond is not quite the man he used to be. Quick cutting. There's lots of quick cutting in this to be used during action sequences to affect the pace. There's a lot of transitions and use of superimposed text. So that's where they say where they are, like Shanghai, for example, to show a location and allowing the audience to keep up. And you've also got shot reverse shot to connect Bond and Silver during any of their interactions. So, for example, when he's in Silver's lair and there's an interaction, there's a lot of shot reverse shot to show their parallel and their unity with each other. Context questions then. Now, there's a few things they could talk about on here and a few things you could talk about. The fear of cyber attacks and cyber terrorism was a big thing at the time. Technology had come on leaps and bounds, and people were using technology to terrorize others, sort of like attacking companies and attacking infrastructure. And there was a very real threat of cyber terrorism. So there were a lot of cyber attacks from forces outside of the UK. Britishness and British culture. Bond is a significant part of British culture, and it's a significant film that we have had for a very long time, and they've pretty much always been made in Britain. Nowadays, there's a bit of a fusion between American and British, but for the most part, it's been made in Britain. And it reflects this idea of British culture, of the stoic, suave detectives and so on, okay? Post 9/11 cinema and the Nolan effect. Now, post 9/11 cinema is this idea that cinema got darker post 9/11. So a lot more of our heroes had darker and grittier moments, and sort of things that you would expect to be quite lively and upbeat instead became darker. So, for example, Batman, which did have darker moments with other directors, they sort of became synonymous with Christopher Nolan because Nolan made these characters darker and grittier. Okay, so the Nolan effect or Nolan-esque cinema heavily influences Bond. And post 9/11 cinema, with Bond becoming a darker, grittier character with flaws rather than being this perfect spy who can get all the women, is really important to his character development. Some may argue that that came in with Casino Royale because that was a much darker film. But sort of in a film critic way, Skyfall was a new chapter for Bond and a new departure from what was old. You've also got MGM Studios in the Bond franchise. MGM almost collapsed as a studio before Skyfall. Skyfall was a last-ditch effort. It was also the first film not to be based on any work of Ian Fleming's. So it was, rather than being based on the books, it was instead just an original story, whereas a lot of the older books were just mishmashes of, the older films were a mishmash of different books or focused on one book in particular. And finally, in the world today, misogyny in Bond became a bit of a hot topic, and how Bond represents this misogynistic kind of character who just sleeps with women or treats women poorly. So you can use that when it comes to context to see whether or not Bond has changed over time to become a more acceptable character in modern film. With the advent of things like the Me Too movement and so on, and the exploitation of women, does Bond still have a place in the modern world? Okay, I hope that's been useful, and that's the last video for revision. Obviously, I may come out with a video to show you some exemplar like I've done before, but in terms of content, this is the last content video. So expect an example video soon, but other than that, that's what I've got for you. Thank you.